are they? The lost boys? They're the children who fall out of the perambulators when the nurse is looking the other way. Oh, what fun it must be. Yes, but we are rather lonely. You see, we have no female companionship. Girls, you know, are much too clever to fall out of their prams.
At what point did you feel you entered into manhood?
I don't really think I've ever entered into manhood. I think I'm smarter and have a better handle on my life and my emotions at 32 than I did at 25, and certainly than I did at 18. But I don't feel like I'm an adult or that I have a clear sense of where I'm going. I think like a lot of men my age, I feel very adrift culturally. I'm not sure that I have clear purpose in my life. I have pursuits, interests, but I always did. And I haven't figured out how to construct a life from that. And then I don't have much responsibility in my life. I don't have a pet. I don't have a girlfriend. Don't have a wife. Don't have children. So I can really kind of, if I want to stay up till 3 a.m. reading, or if I want to get up at 5 a.m. and go to the gym, I can do that. I don't have to check with anyone how I spend my money or my time. And I suppose that's freedom, but it doesn't necessarily feel great all the time. Sometimes, very often actually, it feels like being lost and adrift.
And if you were to think back in time to your boyhood, would you say there was a marked transition from being a boy into becoming an adolescent male?
Yeah, it would have becoming an adolescent male was kind of awakening to women and romantic interests in women, and then all of the anxieties attendant on that. Being a boy was very carefree and fun, and I miss it.
Did you experience any kind of rite of passage in becoming a young man, do you think?
As opposed to a boy?
From being a boy to becoming a young man? Probably
just first relationship. That was a shift, accommodating my personality to a woman in a like romantic and longer term setting. And then also, I should say, as a boy, you have at least I think most boys don't have very close female friends, but becoming romantically involved with a woman was the first time, not only that I became intimate with a woman, but like psychologically intimate, but she displaced all of my male friends in importance in my life, which I think is something that happens to most men in relationships. Men certainly complain about this, that when one of their friends finds love, he kind of drops out of their friend circles. I think that's true of men and women, that their romantic partners become their most important relationships.
And certainly your first romantic relationship, I think, for both men and women is very formative.
Yes.
Okay, well, how would you define masculinity right now in the 20?
I don't think we know how to define masculinity, and I think the question is fraught with problems, because to define masculinity, you almost have to do it in opposition to femininity. And I think a lot of our cultural problems stem from either our inability to do that or our unwillingness to do that. I think masculine men are competent and self-confident. They know what they want, and they're able and willing to pursue what they want. And I think both men and women respond positively to men like that. And there are not many men like that. I don't think I know many more men who are not self-confident, afraid to say what they want, afraid to pursue what they want, and very adrift in life. I think that's becoming almost more the norm for men in their 20s and maybe even 30s these days.
Do you ever feel masculine?
I feel competent playing sports in the gym. I've noticed that I tend to gravitate towards pursuits where I can feel like a certain level of mastery, and that I can see a path forward.
For example?
Amateur sports are like that. Video games are like that. For me, reading, which is an important hobby to me, is like that. My career is not like that. A lot of men actually, their only kind of source of meaning is career. And they kind of devote themselves to that very fully. try to make more money, try to climb the corporate ladder, that type of thing.
What about at the gym when you're lifting weights?
It's just, you're in an environment where you know where you stand, and you know roughly where you want to go and how to get there, and you feel competence in that environment.
And what about the effect it has on you physiologically in terms of how you see yourself as a man?
Yeah, it's a source of positive self-esteem. It's an investment in yourself, and you leave the gym feeling like you've accomplished something. Absolutely. And you're also testing yourself against an objective standard, which is really nice, I think, as a man. 200 pounds is always 200 pounds. And it feels good to reach your plateaus and then break through them.
Clear objectives, clear goals.
Clear objectives, clear goals. I think video games are, a huge part of the psychological attraction of video games is that they offer exactly that ladder of improvement for men. They're very good at quantifying performance and showing you where you stack up against other people. And that taps into something very male, very competitive, very basic in us.
In your, I guess, literary and cultural understanding of masculinity and manhood, how would you define it? What does it look like to you in maybe a more idealistic sense?
I think that the concept masculinity only makes sense in a kind of yin and yang relationship with femininity. And I think two of the pillars of masculinity in that relationship are protection and provision. And I think one of the tragedies of the modern world for men is that neither of those things are necessary anymore. We don't live on the frontier. We've tamed nature to a very large extent, and women can make their own money and enter into the workforce and provide for themselves. So the two kind of pillars of male self-identity have been weakened or even fully eroded. And then the question for men becomes, how do I make myself attractive? How do I actualize myself? And I don't know that we have a culture that supplies an answer to that question.
And I guess, are there any examples of men, modern day men, who exemplify masculinity to you, or the positive traits of masculinity?
You talking about in my life, or celebrities, or
either?
I've always thought of the coaches that I've known as being as being kind of positive masculine role models. They're very competent. They're very exacting. They have harsh standards and they expect you to meet them. But they also they're encouraging of you in trying to meet those standards. And some of those coaches have been formal coaches. They've been people who are literal basketball coaches, football coaches, in high school or college. But I've had friends play that role for me, for example, with weightlifting. I've never had formal coaching, but I've had friends who are more competent and more experienced and older than me. And they've said, hey, yeah, do this, try this. Mentors, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I really enjoy that. I think men enjoy taking on that role. I've done that too for younger men now that I'm in my 30s. And I've seen men, I couldn't call them my friends because we don't speak about, I don't know anything about them personally. They don't know anything about me personally, but they're fond of me and I'm fond of them. And our relationship is basically one of mentor-mentee, where they're looking for advice in some area of their life and they need encouragement. You can see that really clearly in young men. And I don't think I appreciated that when I was 18, but now that I'm 32 and I look at 18-year-old boys, they really need encouragement, and they need, it's helpful to them to have a model of how to behave that isn't hyper destructive or hyper competitive. You can kind of tilt them towards a more positive way of being. And I've seen that happen, and it's really rewarding to me to play that role.
How crucial, in your opinion, is it that men play that role for other men as opposed to women doing that for young men?
I'm not sure that women can't do it, but in the domains where this happens, like sports, there aren't very, amateur sports, there aren't very many women who would even be able to do that. I play in various amateur pickup sports, and it's probably 95% male to 5% female, and the women aren't consistently showing up, whereas the guys who show up week in, week out for years. It's the same faces. And there are enough men who are destructive in those environments, who are hyper competitive, hyper aggressive, very quick to take offense, very quick to like lose their tempers, that if there isn't a kind of contrasting model of how to be and how to be competitive, a more honorable way to be competitive, let's say, the younger boys can kind of
easily be persuaded that it's okay to behave a certain way.
Yeah, exactly.
And men mentoring young men have a positive impact that way.
Yeah, absolutely.
Would you say that most men between the ages of 20 and 30 right now feel very confident in themselves?
No, absolutely not. And then not only would I say that most men don't feel confident in themselves, but I've met men who I presumed were very confident in themselves because they had the outward, like they knew how to dress, or they were good looking, or they were very fit. And I thought, okay, like this person, they know who they are, and they know like the positive reaction they get from the world because of whatever positive traits they have. And as I've gotten to know them, I found that often those are some of the most insecure men, or the most uncertain of themselves, let's say. And that's very interesting to experience that little perspective shift.
How would you describe the men who do exhibit high levels of confidence in our society? Who are those men?
Generally, I think they have some degree of outward success from which they can draw that confidence. I don't know many men who are intrinsically confident. There are men who are intrinsically confident and well-adjusted and happy in themselves. I think that's great. I don't know that they'll ever be a majority of people. But I just encounter in my daily life many more men who are insecure and uncertain and withdrawn.
Do you think our society is aware that most men don't feel very confident in themselves?
No, not at all.
Can you elaborate on that? Why not?
I think the men who draw the most attention are the men who are hyper confident and hyper successful, and we're sort of oblivious to the men who are not confident, not successful, and particularly the men who are failing. And there are many, many men failing spectacularly right now. I also think the value of equality has become sort of an absolute for us in the post-Christian West. And so the men who are failing are paradoxically doing their part to make society more equal. Like if more men drop out of high school and don't attend university, then women's labor force participation goes up and their incomes go up. And that's seen as a good thing. You can point to statistics if you're a strict egalitarian and that suggests that, oh, look, like the world's getting more equal. But it's hard not to notice the male dropout rate, for example, or in high school, the literacy rates for men are reading, I think it's a full grade level, and often depending on either the ethnicity of the men or their income bracket, it's 2 or 3 grade levels behind women. And that's not good for those men, at least.
Why do you think this is going unnoticed or underreported?
I don't think there's an interest. Well, there's many reasons. One of them is there's a philosophical reason, which is that, as I said, male failure paradoxically contributes to equality, and we can spin it in a way that women are succeeding. The world's getting more equal. I think also we're afraid to look at male failure. I think male pain, male suffering are frightening topics, and we'd rather not acknowledge their existence. I think men play a part in this. They don't want to acknowledge their own weakness. They don't want to speak about their own failings or their own trials. I think there are good reasons why they don't want to do that, but they're not quick to say, like men who are going through a terrible time, if you ask them point blank, how are you doing? Oh, I'm okay.
Suffering.
It's very, men are not quick to share their pain. So they absolutely have they bear some responsibility for this. But I also think, and it would be interesting to discuss this at greater length, but I don't think I think the thought or the vision of men failing frightens us, because I think there's something psychological in us that looks still to men for leadership, which I think is a real difficulty with women in the workforce, that they have a harder time assuming authority. But the flip side of that is the men who are failing, people don't want to acknowledge it or look at it, or it frightens us.
Which is interesting because I think part of the current prevailing popular narrative about men hinges on toxic masculinity, male privilege, and the patriarchy, and the consequences of all of those things in our society.
Those are all very ideological concepts. You'll hear them frequently if you're attending college or if you're a regular reader of the New York Times, for example. But in Middle America or Middle Canada, most people have no idea what those words mean in that ideological definition.
What I'm curious about is, for someone who is educated at a liberal arts college and lives on the East Coast, and you are in a city in Canada, when did you start to feel or realize that those prevailing narratives didn't really match your experience as a young man in the West?
I've always been repulsed by them. I think it's actually very repulsive that this concept of male privilege comes out of tenured academics teaching for 9 months a year, having 3 months off, give or take, and working entirely indoors, when so many men still work physical labor outdoors and they do it for less pay. I mean, it's just astonishing. And then one of the pivots is, well, historically men had all the privilege. And my blood boils when I hear people speak like this, possibly because I have older parents and grandparents, but the men who fought in Vietnam or the Second World War or the First World War, they weren't privileged. They didn't ask to be put in those scenarios and to be shot at and have to shoot at total strangers. That was a price they paid for being male in society. It was their contribution. That wasn't a privilege.
When people use the phrase male entitlement, how does that make you feel?
I mean, there are entitled men. It's all of these sayings have their kernel of truth to them. And so, for example, rapists are entitled. Rapists feel entitled. But then often there's a kind of concept creep where that description of men who rape as entitled bleeds into men who ask random women out on the street, who take their chances on a total stranger. Oh, that's entitlement. You feel entitled to her time or her attention. And I mean, there are better and worse ways to ask a total stranger out. I don't think most men feel very entitled. I think like modern men, there are men who pay dating coaches for, their fear of asking a woman out for coffee is so great that they have to pay a dating coach to help them do it. They'll spend hundreds of hours on YouTube, trying to work up the confidence to do it. And there are men who do this. I mean, I have friends who, everywhere they go, they'll approach every beautiful woman they see. And then I have other friends who, you could spend hours saying, hey, like, you should ask her out. You should ask her out. You see her every day. She sees you. You have a nice conversation, even though it's, perfunctory. Take a chance. And you can do that for 6 months and they still won't do it. I've seen that. That's more common to me among the men I know than the kind of constant asking strange women out.
And over the last few years that we've been discussing the male experience and the dysfunction in our society regarding the relationship between men and women, professionally and personally, we've both come to the conclusion several times that women have very little understanding of men, how they think, what motivates them.
And vice versa.
Mm-hmm.
Of necessity, because you only have firsthand experience of your own male experience of the world or your own female experience of the world.
Right. So what are some clear examples of that to you from the male perspective?
Women misunderstanding men?
Mm-hmm.
Where to begin?
Let's start with, I don't know, something like sports and competition, maybe.
I think women dramatically underestimate how important competition is to men and how competitive men can be and how single-minded they can be. And if you don't have a brother or brothers, or if you haven't been in co-ed sports and seen firsthand how seriously men can take even very trivial competition, that's quite shocking, that discrepancy. And that that plays a greater role in our modern society than it ever has, because women who enter the workforce are entering a competitive environment where they're going to be competing for positions and status and salaries against men who are hyper competitive. Not all men are equally competitive, obviously, but the average man seems to be much more competitive than the average woman, and that means more. Competition means more to men than it does to women.
What's another example?
Oh God, in dating, the confusion there is immense. Men and women aren't attracted to the same things in one another. And
it's a miracle they even end up together at times.
Well, it seems that way to me.
So for example,
oh God, you're gonna get me in trouble. I often hear women say, I'm a catch because X, Y, Z. I own my own home. I own my own condo. I have a PhD. I speak 3 languages. Those are all like intrinsically wonderful things, but none of those are intrinsically attractive for men. That men aren't drawn to women who are. It's not that we're repulsed by it. It's just not an intrinsically attractive thing to men. They
don't necessarily factor into men's decision to date someone.
Men will prioritize youth and beauty over almost everything else. At least in attraction. I'm not talking about love and respect or marriage. I mean, when men marry, if they make that decision to commit to someone for life, it's for more than youth and beauty. But absent youth and beauty, there's a problem, and there's a hyper. This is all of these things are just minefields that I know I'm canceled from the second that I say this. The New York Times, for example, posted, this was a year ago. They reported on a study on, I think it was OkCupid, about the average age, the age that is most attractive to each gender. And for women, it was something like 3 to 5 years older than whatever age they were. So like 18-year-old women, 21-year-old men, 24-year-old women, 27-year-old men. But for men of all ages, including 50-year-old men, the most attractive ages were the youngest, 18, 19, 20. And the metric for that was who the men message and who the women message, or who they're likely to respond to messages from. And overwhelmingly, youth for men was the signal attractive quality. And I think there are eminently biological reasons why that would be so. But a woman who doesn't realize that and spends her 20s in education or in career and then expects at 30 or 35 to be as attractive to men as she was at 20 or 25 is in for a painful wake-up call. And I think our culture is terrified to say that and would like to change that. I think we believe we can change that, and I don't believe we can. I think that's intrinsic to human nature, to male nature.
And yet I would also argue that at least part of our culture is overwhelmingly aware of how important it is to be young and beautiful. If you just pivot to Instagram.
That's part of the cognitive dissonance here, is that at the same time as we're trying to change human nature itself, we have celebrities getting plastic surgery. We have 25-year-old girls,
18-year-old Instagram influencers.
Yeah.
Getting plastic surgery to stay as young looking as possible.
Yes. It's actually a terrible sign of how corrupt our culture is, that we have all of these contradictions that we're unwilling to discuss, even though they're very glaring. They're right in front of us. I'm going to say, too, I've just said something controversial about what men find attractive, but something equally controversial about what women find attractive. Women find competent, successful, highly educated, high-earning men attractive. Those are the kind of criteria that if you were, like, we've done studies on dating websites where they'll manipulate, the career a man lists in his dating profile. And the higher status and higher earning that career is, the more attention he gets from women. So part of the devil, or the the difficulty of pursuing absolute equality, is that as you do that, you of necessity reduce the number of men who are intrinsically attractive to women, or who have managed to make themselves attractive, I should say, by acquiring high income and high status, which is one of the reasons men are not very progressive in large numbers. Like, what's happening in the Western world is there's a gradual but visible bifurcation in the vote. Men are becoming more conservative and women are becoming more liberal, let's say. And I think a big reason for that is that the more you push equality, the more you hamper men's dating and sexual opportunities. And they're not going to take that lightly.
normal feminists.
No, but that's part of how awful this moment is that we really do have a gender war going on, I think.
I think we do have a gender war.
To the detriment of both genders. No one's going to win this war. We will both lose.
In terms of what concerns you and I, men are dropping out of society and failing, as you said, across the board.
I would say also, failing, yes. Like the men who end up addicted to opiates and overdosing. That's a very fatal conclusion for those men.
Well, I was going to say, like, give me
the
a
worst
list.
case scenario.
Give me a list of examples of how men are dropping out of society.
The mild form, which I can't even count how many men I know who do this. They just sort of coast through life, and they make enough money to be comfortable in their jobs and in their lifestyle. And in 2020, that doesn't take, unless you're living in New York, where the cost of living is sky high. It doesn't take a ton of money to live comfortably as a single man in the modern world. And they just maximize their leisure time. And a lot of that is video games. A lot of that is pornography. Stunning for a minority of men, a stunning amount of pornography watching, video game playing, Netflix binging, fantasy sports. I can't even, I'm so dismayed at how many of my friends can spend 20 hours a week or 15 hours a week watching football or watching basketball or watching baseball. And then, the fantasy sports leagues that they play in it's not that it's just, they're kind of mindless hobbies, frankly. They're not necessarily productive hobbies. They don't make you a better citizen. You're not more informed about the world. And yet this has captured so much male time and attention and energy, which is great for those industries. The video game industry has exploded. Their success has been predicated on men dropping out in a big way and ceasing to make themselves future husbands and future fathers.
And apart from people like Jordan Peterson, Christina Hoff Sommers, Janice Fumenko, and I know there are others, public intellectuals and authors who have been trying to highlight for society some of the things that men are currently experiencing. Do you feel there's anyone advocating on behalf of men right now or the male experience?
No. Jordan Peterson's rise sort of signals to me how many men needed that kick in the ass. And I'm actually I'm heartened because so much of his appeal was you don't get to blame other people. You have to take responsibility for your own life. And I'm gratified that so many men could find that a positive message.
And they found him on the internet because that's where they've retreated to.
Yes, partially because that's where they've retreated to, and partially because academia has become deeply corrupt and a closed system, and it's not a place where truth is highly valued. Conformity to certain principles and ideas and ideologies is much more highly valued there. And one of the things that I love and I think they hate about Jordan Peterson is that you can put him up against almost anyone in an open environment and people will gravitate towards him. Whereas if you take the 5 most influential academics of the last 50 years, people like Lacan, Derrida, Foucault, I'm blanking on the woman who wrote Gender Trouble, Judith Butler. My God, if you put them in a public forum, they'd be jeered. If we had cabbages to throw at them, we'd throw cabbages at them. They simply couldn't convince people in an open environment that they have anything worth saying. But in the closed environment of academia, they were able to kind of capture gradually people's hearts and minds.
And money.
But that's exactly what that's part of the contrast, is that one ideology thrives on the internet. Like Jordan Peterson can thrive on the internet in a way that he's suppressed in universities. And the ideologies that are thriving in universities would be dead on arrival on the internet. That cliche phrase, open market of ideas, doesn't serve the far left progressive human nature as malleable crowd.
Do you consider yourself a lost boy?
In many ways, yes. I'm 32, and I would have, if I could have had my ideal life, I would have been a father by now. I think I would have preferred to have been a young father than an old father, and I'm not sure at the rate I'm going I ever will be a father. So that's, and I'm not making any efforts in that front. But at the same time, and this has saved me many times. I have a sense of purpose, and I have hobbies that interest me immensely and that give me meaning and solace when life gets difficult. I think that's what so many men, absent a wife and kids, they lack the sense of meaning and reassurance that comes from having a family or from having a goal outside of themselves that they can strive towards.
Providing your own sense of direction.
Providing your own sense of direction, yeah. That's a very difficult thing for any single human being to do. It really is.
I was just going to say, I can relate to that.
Yeah. Well, I think actually that's relatively gender neutral. I think a lot of women, they in their 20s, they kind of throw themselves into whatever they're pursuing, be it career or education. But I think they have this crisis at around 30 if they don't have a family, when all of a sudden they reevaluate how they've been living their lives, and they become kind of concerned that they're not where they expected to be.
And what do you aspire to as a man, ultimately? Let's say you can carve out exactly.
I would have wanted to have been to be a father and a husband. I think those are admirable and noble things to be. And it's funny, I meet a lot of men who say the exact same thing, and who feel utterly unsure, as I do, of how you're supposed to get those things in the modern world. It's not as easy as you would think. The path towards that has been obscured dramatically. And I think women feel that way too at a certain point.
I think the path's been obscured for all of us in this millennial generation.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I do believe that. I'm often, when I have this discussion, particularly with women, they defend these changes as being increases in freedom, which is true, that we have much more. I think
a lot of men would defend that same, the same reasons.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think there are a lot more men, at least in their 20s, who are dissatisfied, and maybe they don't know why, but they understand that this freedom isn't necessarily such a positive thing. And I think the reason
they're not benefiting from it.
They're not benefiting from it, or they don't think.
Like maybe single women in their mid-30s are no longer benefiting.
But that was what I was going to say, is that the single women in their 20s are benefiting from it. They think they're getting the best of both worlds because they don't have trouble navigating their romantic relationships. Not as much trouble anyway. There's still a lot of women in their 20s who complain about modern dating, but they don't have trouble, getting a date, let's say, whereas a lot of men just can't even get a date.
What is it specifically about marriage and being a father that you think is important as a man, that is meaningful as a man?
I think it gives you a purpose, and it helps sanctify what you're doing. And if you have someone to provide for, whether that's your wife or your children, that's something that will help motivate you at work. Whereas if all you're doing is providing for yourself, you can get away with working less, and a lot of men would be happy to, or think they would be happy to say, I want to work less, or I don't want to have that pressure. But at the same time, there's real reward in having your life mean something to other people. And marriage and parenthood are the ultimate forms of that. To be a parent is to have your life maximally important to young people.
And for you personally?
I would say exactly that. To feel recognized and understood and sympathetic to someone else, and to have that recognition and sympathy for another human being. Part of what I think is driving, I describe our culture as very juvenile, which I don't think is controversial in an era when Donald Trump is the president and you just have to go on his Twitter feed. I think part of what's made our culture so juvenile is that so few people are becoming parents, and they're doing it so much later in life. And becoming a parent is what, for many people, forces adulthood and responsibility and maturity onto them. So if we lose that as a life goal, or if we try to prolong it indefinitely, we end up with a very juvenile culture. I don't think people should be dating in their 30s as a norm. I really think by 30 you should be more or less settled, and you should be building something. And I think it's a sad sign of our times that that's become normalized.
Hi, I'm Christina.
And I'm Phil.
We're siblings, we're millennials. And what you just heard is an excerpt from one of the many recorded conversations we've been having in private over the years about men, the role men play in our society, and the now dysfunctional dynamic between men and women. And we decided that it might be interesting and maybe even fruitful, to share them. We're really tired of mainstream narratives on men, and we don't feel the way forward is to fuel an ongoing gender war, where nobody wins. We want to start new conversations about the role men play in our society, and we want to bring attention to what we feel is an underreported phenomenon, and we're calling this phenomenon the Lost Boys. You may have heard about them in Peter Pan. Here's a modern-day portrait of who they are now. They're the young men who have fallen behind, dropped out. At some point on life's path, they took a wrong turn, or missed some crucial step. They are not following in the footsteps of the generations of men before them, from education to employment to marriage and family, but neither do they know where they're going. They exist in a perpetual limbo, suspended between adolescence and adulthood, without the guidance or encouragement of their culture. Unable to find their footing in the real world, many of them have retreated to the virtual world, for the comfort and reassurance that they have at the very least a valued role to play. We no longer know what to do with men. The dominant cultural message for decades has been that equality is the ultimate goal, construed largely along educational and economic lines. Under such a paradigm, men are a problem. They dominate the higher ranks of corporations and government. They work longer hours for more consecutive years in more lucrative fields. They earn more money. Male ambition, effort, and success have come to be viewed as obstacles to women's equality, rather than as an engine of economic growth, or the means of providing for a family. The locus of these attacks has been the concept of traditional gender roles, which are reconfigured not as a means to help men and women navigate life's challenges in a way that brings them together to their mutual benefit, but as the remnants of an archaic and oppressive system purpose-built to hold women back. If the cultural roles of the past were entirely oppressive, then only good can come from their abolition. But the young men and women coming of age under this new regime of freedom and fluidity often find themselves confused, stressed, and unable to navigate the opaque challenges of the modern world. For men, these changes have been profound. Dramatic declines in their workforce participation, in their college attendance, and in their marriage rates. Record numbers of men between the ages of 18 and 35 now live with their parents. These changes have gone all but unremarked upon by society at large, which has preferred to judge the well-being of all men by the success of the high achievers. Where society once offered men a path forward, in the often painful transition from adolescence to adulthood, there is now a freedom that looks suspiciously like indifference. And while many men are thriving, professionally and personally, with this newfound freedom, a sizable minority has lost its way. They are the Lost Boys, and they deserve a voice, separate from what the politicians and the pundits and the ideologues are saying about them. Our podcast series explores the untold stories of what happened to men, what is happening to men, and why they are dropping out of society. Look around you. Take stock of your family and friends. We bet you know a lost boy too.